they're achieving at the 95th percentile, great. And
Check,
we think,
check.
wow, teachers are grading, doing an excellent job.
Yeah.
And right, like, I don't care. Like, I don't care what, like if you're achieving at the 99.9th percentile,
Yep.
um, if you are not growing, then we're failing, that school is not
Mhm.
serving its purpose, right? Every
Right.
child deserves access to equitable growing and equitable learning and growth
Yes.
opportunities. So you
Yes.
can think of it kind of like as a stretch
Yeah.
opportunity quotient. Everyone should have opportunities to grow
Mhm.
and learn at school. And if not, we're teaching them implicitly that they don't
Ugh,
that they don't belong,
it don't
right? That
matter.
they have
Yep.
we're invalidating their lived
Yes.
experience and marginalizing. And
Mhm.
that's happens pretty regularly. There aren't a lot of districts that monitor the growth data for students who are neurodivergent gifted. They look at those achievement levels.
Welcome to Heart Parents. Let's connect with our kids and learn together. I'm Carrie. I was a former teacher and speech therapist. I'm also a parent of two spirited, gifted, highly sensitive kids. I was quickly brought to my knees as a parent when I thought that I would see a rosy lens version of parenting just as they present on Instagram, but I quickly learned that's not real life. I will provide real life experiences and transform them into moments for connections and change for you to use in your house. Hi there, conscious parents. Before we start today's episode, it's Carrie here, and I wanted to reach out to ask you guys for a quick favor. As a follower of our show, we would love for you to give us a 5-star rating and leave us a review. It can be just a few words, that's it. And it really goes a long way with us, with the podcasting community on Apple or Spotify. So thanks so much for tuning in, and I'm so excited for you to hear today's message. Happy listening. Hi there, and welcome back to Heart Carrie, or Heart to Heart Parents. I'm Carrie. I'm your friendly, conscious parent here. And today I have a really special guest who is joining me locally from where I am, which is really fun. I haven't had that lately. And she is Dr. Kate Bachtel. You can correct me if I say it
Or
wrong.
Bachtel.
Bachtel, thank you.
Yeah.
She studies and designs exemplary programming for neurodivergent, gifted, and 2E youth and facilitates professional learning through the nonprofit Soul Spark Learning while also teaching in BVSD or Boulder Valley School District. She has a doctorate in curriculum and instruction with a gifted emphasis, and she's a published author on topics related to giftedness and emotional development. And I am so excited to have her here today. I was telling her before we started that as I was raising my kids, and I would hit pieces of not knowing what to do, not knowing exactly how to entertain or maybe engage, or why I was seeing certain things come up with my kiddos, my aunt would always say, look into the gifted and talented pieces. And I was like, oh, but this is behavioral. And I see that as part of it, but I don't know how that relates. And as I started to dive in and really understand GNT, it really helped me to connect with my kids and understand why they were doing certain things, what their needs were, and how they were seeking out that intellectual challenges in their lives. So I'm so excited to have you, Dr. Kate. Is that okay if we call
Yeah.
you?
Sure. Thanks for having me, Carrie. I'm
Yeah.
glad we were able to make time together.
Yeah, it's so fun to have you here. I was so lucky I got to attend one of your sessions for Soul Spark recently. I think it was this spring. And as you were talking during it, I kept thinking, oh my gosh, you're describing both of my children. And it was so interesting. I think you had mentioned, um, and I keep using this everywhere when I'm talking to people about G&T as the child, as the intellectual levels go up, there's often a possibility of having another disorder. Is that correct in how I'm saying
Well,
it?
like as IQ increases,
Yes.
so do the asynchronies in learning and development,
Okay.
right? And so sometimes you think of, like, in the autism community, they talk about splinter skills, right? And like
Mm.
extreme strengths and then otherwise challenges. And so I'm going to say that I might have like somewhat of a controversial perspective on this within the gifted community, but I think that when it comes to asynchrony, it's hard to delineate where asynchrony ends and twice exceptionality begins. Twice exceptionality is the term we use for youth who might be eligible for an advanced learning plan or maybe identification criteria for gifted, and also have a diagnosed disability. And so the 2E is oftentimes referenced in terms of like IDEA legislation, and if you'd be eligible for an individualized education program, an IEP or 504.
Mm.
And
Okay.
so sometimes that where the asynchronies and development lie determine whether or not one would be considered twice exceptional, right?
Mm-hmm.
So if I have, so if my asynchrony is such that I'm a very precocious reader or hyperlexic, reading comes very easy to me, but then maybe I struggle more with the pragmatics of speech and social
Mm-hmm.
communication and my
Yep.
ability to connect, then maybe that twice exceptionality might be more likely to be recognized in a school setting, where someone might be eligible for an IEP or 504 under the category of autism and identify maybe as autistic. And yet, or if the asynchrony, let's say, like myself, I'm tone deaf. I would love to be a musician and be able to sing. Like I love music and that form of expression, but yet
Mm-hmm.
I am completely tone deaf, and so that's part
Yeah.
of my personal asynchrony, right? And
Mm.
so that might not be considered a disability within a school context, but yet if I was attending a music program, like
Yes.
I would need definitely like specialized services and supports to be able to not hurt other people's ears, right? So it's there's a context piece to it, but most youth who are identified as neurodivergent gifted often have times have asynchronies in their learning and development, whether it's related to their
Mm.
motor skills, their executive function skills, their literacy skills, calculation skills, their motor, like all of the things, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so we just have responsibility, just like with any child, to make sure that they have what they need to thrive, that their strengths are fed and nourished, but also that
Yes.
they have the support
Yes.
that's needed. And with our students, those exceptionalities can mask one another. So oftentimes they don't get the support they need for either in
Mm-hmm.
traditional school
Yes.
models.
Yes. That can be super challenging, I'm sure.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, what are some of the components of an exemplary program for these kiddos?
Right. That's a big question, and there are a lot of pieces to it and levels to it, right? We want each child to have access, first and foremost, to highly qualified, culturally responsive teachers, right?
Mm-hmm.
And in teacher preparation programs, we don't get training oftentimes in neurodivergence and gifted in terms of how that development might unfold or look different
Yeah.
than same age peers. And so, if you don't have that understanding of how children are experiencing the world, including the asynchronies, the needs oftentimes for different depth, pace, and complexity of instruction, how can you be responsive? Because right, these are unseen differences that
Mm.
children can mask in the classroom setting. So having educators that understand how neurodivergent, gifted, twice exceptional children are experiencing the world is critical. If they don't have
Yeah.
that training, it's
Yeah.
already a recipe for disaster,
Yeah.
right? And then that cultural responsive piece, historically, we've had a lot of under-identification or historical exclusion, especially of bilingual, Latinx, African American, Indigenous, multi-exceptional youth for a lot of reasons, including shortcomings in the assessments that are used to identify, cultural factors, right? Like if we're a more individualist culture and children come from a culture that's more collective and
Mm.
where group performance is more valued and there's more humility and
Mm.
not wanting to stand out. Um, those characteristics of giftedness might be presenting differently, and we might be missing children who need, again, different programming.
Mm.
Um, Programming focused on growth, Carrie. right?
Okay.
Like
Yep.
is another
Yep.
thing, like, right, if we're thinking about responsive and
Yes.
neuro-inclusive programming for gifted. So oftentimes we're just looking at achievement levels,
Hmm.
right? Like if a
Yeah.
child, wow, if they're achieving at the 95th percentile, great. And
Check,
we think,
check.
wow, teachers are grading, doing an excellent job.
Yep.
And right, like I don't care. Like I don't care what like if you're achieving at the 99.9th percentile,
Yep.
um, if you are not growing, then we're failing. That school is not
Hmm.
serving its purpose, right? Every
Right.
child deserves access to equitable growing and equitable learning and growth
Yes.
opportunities. So you
Yes.
can think of it kind of like as a stretch
Yep.
opportunity quotient. Everyone should have opportunities to grow,
Hmm.
grow and learn at school. And if not, we're teaching them implicitly that they don't
Ugh,
that they don't belong,
no
right? That
matter.
they have
Yep.
we're invalidating their lived
Yes.
experience and marginalizing. And
Hmm.
that's happens pretty regularly. There aren't a lot of districts that monitor the growth data for students who are neurodivergent gifted. They look at those achievement levels and be like, oh,
Hmm.
and again, we'll pat ourselves on the back and say, ooh,
Check,
wow, 95th
check. Yep.
percentile.
Yep.
Um, but then later on, oftentimes these students, if they haven't had access to those growth stretch opportunities, they get to middle and high school, and then
Yes.
teachers are like, "Oh, these skills are these kids aren't motivated. They shouldn't be in the advanced math class.
Mm.
They shouldn't be in calculus or geometry, whatever it might be, or be taking multiple languages in, or it's whatever that they're interested or curious in because." Look at because they aren't motivated, and sometimes that happens when children aren't given the opportunity to develop the growth
Yes.
mindset or resilience, right? We talk about
Yes.
that being so critical, but if you're not if you don't have opportunities to move outside your comfort zone, you don't
Hmm.
get to develop grit in the same way that your peers do because you don't have as much practice
Hmm.
learning um, that failure is sometimes requisite to growth or like how to navigate
Yeah.
that.
Yeah.
Um, and so programming focused on growth is another piece.
Okay.
Access to true peers,
Okay.
right? Like if you think of that
Oh.
being another thing, it's hard to see yourself or deeply know yourself without a mirror,
Hmm.
right? And you talk about for our neurodivergent gifted youth, especially those in rural settings, like here where we are in
Mm.
Colorado,
Yeah.
80% of our school districts are rural.
Yeah. Yep.
Only 20% of our student population, but approximately 80% of our schools are rural. And so it's less likely if you're neurodivergent gifted
Right.
that you're going to have a peer. And then that can be very socially isolating and marginalizing, right?
Hmm.
If you want to invent a complex game at recess and all the other
Yes.
like kids of your same age, like just don't have that same interest in that level of complexity, then you're
Hmm.
playing by yourself,
Yep.
right? And so that is invaluable. And many parents, especially like parents that have maybe gone to a homeschool or unschool world school
Yep.
model because they didn't have programming, what they are hungry for is finding opportunities for their kids to connect, whether online or through other programming.
Yeah.
Because just that in and of itself, putting the kids together, it's like they can finally breathe, right? And have mirrors and understand, like be essentially be validated.
Yeah.
And learning is different, right? When you put a group of neurodivergent gifted youth together, the learning increases exponentially because we can all like play off each other, and it's just a
Oh
different
yeah.
experience that
Yeah.
can be hard to conceptualize if you haven't seen it before,
I love
right?
the like the rabbit holes, right? It's like, well, why does
Yeah.
this work? And then they can just go with the teacher down a rabbit hole. Why does this work? Why does this? And they all feed off of each other when they're in that similar mindset. I love it.
Right. And keeping in mind that there's like, if you think about that traditional scatter plot, like normally distributed data, right, there can be more
Hmm.
distance among the outliers. There can be more diversity
Yeah.
at a program for gifted youth than in a neighborhood school sometimes, right? So
Hmm.
even when we're talking about like bouncing and having that similarity, it's the diversity that also oftentimes fuels them because in that
Yeah.
program, one student might have interests, they might have competing and contrasting strengths and interests that allow them to collaborate and innovate in a unique way too, where one might be more of a
Yeah.
visual spatial thinker and communicator,
Yeah.
one might be more musically or artistically inclined. And
Yes.
then there's just unique and I'm going to say, I want to say a certain brand of magic that
Mm,
happens when they
yeah.
have that sanctuary to come together and have specialized programming.
I love that.
Um, so I'm like thinking about like I'm just gonna go through it like it's kind of a few more things that are in my brain because it's a big question, right? But when you're talking about
Yes.
neuroclusive,
Yes.
adequate funding,
Yes.
right?
Whew.
And
That's a hard
so
one.
like you look at our like a good way to look at a measure neuroinclusivity is, are you funding gifted and special education at commensurate levels, right? Because they're all exceptional. Oftentimes youth are eligible for an IEP if they're 12% or less unique,
Right.
right?
Yeah.
Like and and then within neurodivergent gifted, eligibility for an ALP is usually 5% or
Mm.
less cognitively unique. And so like let's say here's an example, like a local school district here that we're familiar with here in the West, funds elementary special education teachers at a rate of one full-time teacher for about 22 to 23 students.
Yeah.
And then they'll
Yeah.
fund like like someone in a tutor role that's getting paid not as a licensed teacher, but kind of at an hourly rate that you could probably make at McDonald's, to have a caseload of like 65 to 75 students and work 10 hours a week,
Whew.
right?
Yep.
So you have student populations with similar levels of needs in terms of specialized programming oftentimes. And
Yep.
granted, there are exceptions, right? Like if you have a blind student, you might need Braille books. There are medical like expenses tied to medical needs
Hmm.
that it's not going to be perfect, and sometimes it's more, but generally speaking, there should be more similar rates of funding and as a measure of making sure that children have access to those equitable growth opportunities they need to flourish, and basically access to a free and appropriate public
Yep.
education.
Yep.
um, Sensory mindful environments, I know that as
Ooh,
someone passionate about
love
um,
that.
taking care of children with sensory sensitivities of all kinds,
Mhm.
sensory sensitivities, moral sensitivities, emotional sensitivities, creating environments where we're mindful of how light, sounds, textures, content that in text that they're reading might affect children's feelings of um, emotional safety, but also make sure that their sensory systems are in a place that are easeful and calm, and that they can engage and bring their best selves forward, right? Like
Yeah.
a student who's in kindergarten or first grade likely won't be able to articulate, oh my gosh,
Yeah.
those fluorescent lights are making my nervous
Ooh.
system really wonky. They're going to be irritated in their little bodies, right?
Hmm.
And the adults might not understand why there are challenging behaviors. Um, and so the sensory mindful environments are really, really critical.
Yes.
Um,
And we'll be right back after this message.
Hi there, Changemaker moms and dads. It's Carrie here. I hope you're enjoying today's episode. If there's any pieces of this episode that resonate with you, we would love for you to share it with a friend. A little helping hand goes a long way. We appreciate you tuning in, and here's more. They sometimes even like my kiddos in my past or mine, they will hold it together throughout school, not wanting to look different, and then just explode as soon as they come home, and you're like,
yeah,
what just happened? Yeah, so and often would you have anything that you would say to parents? For instance, I had in a previous situation, I would go to teachers and say, um, yes, I know my kid is listed as G&T. Yes, I know my kid is filling out all the paperwork and getting all the worksheets done. And then you hand him a second math sheet. I know he's doing extra work and above reading level, etc. But when he comes home, he explodes. He's exhausted. Is there any room for a sensory break? Is there any way we can change the light setup in here? Is there any way we can reduce his worksheet like half, because writing can be painful for him if he's doing 30 math problems? And I would get a lot of people smiling back at me and saying, I never see anything in class. I don't know what you're talking about. He's always right on it. He's always doing great. So, is there anything that you would be able to share with anybody that's going through a situation that they're not able to change themselves, or what they can ask for, or any ideas?
Well, I think it's tricky, right? Because, and that's why you just illustrated why it's so critical to have really strong parent-school partnerships, because what you see at school might be very different than we see at home, and vice
Mm,
versa
yeah.
for so many reasons. And so if a child is holding it together, and maybe to a certain degree masking throughout the day, because we also know the higher the IQ, the more
Mm,
skilled children can be at masking,
yeah.
that parents are going to see a very fatigued, oftentimes different child who melts and might have more behavioral challenges at home
Hmm.
than at school. And so when you look at advocacy, um, it makes it hard because it's in part contingent on like the openness and experience and expertise of the teacher,
Hmm.
right? You might have a teacher who just generally is very empathic and is a good listener
Hmm.
and a strong partner that can implement accommodations regardless of whether or not they support eligibility for a 504 or again
Hmm.
IEP if needed for disability. Um, but if you have an educator who's not in a school system or district that supports those kinds of partnerships, it becomes really tricky. And so then that's where sometimes it becomes helpful to have partners with medical professionals, clinicians, consultants, or advocates that can speak to the medical need and really focus on that kind of clinical or medical health side.
Yeah.
Um, and oftentimes, again, students who are neurodivergent gifted, it's not atypical for them to have like a again, knowing that we're in the Western medical model, right? Like ideally, as educators, we just provide, and when
Hmm.
need is illustrated. Um, but the reality is, we do live in a community that relies more on Western medicine, but having like oftentimes our youth are eligible for a diagnosis like sensory processing disorder,
Hmm.
ADHD,
Hmm.
autism, dyslexia, etc.
Hmm.
And so sometimes having that medical diagnosis, if there's eligibility, supports accessing the accommodations that
Hmm. Yeah.
um, support all of the neurodivergence,
Yep.
right? Because and so like a 504 is what would provide accommodations
Yep.
for some of those pieces. And then going
Yeah.
that route when you don't have, when the teacher or the system might not have the flexibility, might help your student get access to what they need to be able to access instruction.
Okay, that's really helpful. And I was going to ask you as well,
Yeah.
just thinking, because I know I was an educator, so I had ideas when I would go in and converse
Yeah.
with teachers, but sometimes I know families, I've really held hands with other families and said, like, well, think about asking for this, or have you ever thought about asking for this? What would you have any ideas of what families might be able to say if they're having a situation where their kids are gifted and they're not seeing as much academics changes or challenges or what, and they're not able to move to a different school? I don't know if there's anything that we can say to any of these people
Yeah,
that are
right.
there.
I mean, it becomes really hard, and it's part of
Hmm.
um, something that people don't want to recognize is that, like, in terms of the fields of education and psychology, there are a lot of organizations that
Mm.
have the term gifted in them. And that's
Mm.
the term that has been used historically to
Hmm.
describe the phenomena. But the
Okay.
term itself is problematic because,
Mm.
like, for those of us who work with and have neurodivergent family
Hmm.
members, we know it's not better than, it's just different, right? It's
Hmm.
all a form of exceptionality
Yeah.
that should be like value neutral, right? It should be neutral, like a
Yes.
trait like we have dyslexic processing, ADHD processing, it's not better or worse, it's just different.
Hmm.
And yet the term gifted for so many implies superiority. We know it's not, but because it implies that for some people, the word
Yeah.
gifted is a trigger, a lot of people. the word gifted is a trigger, right? And for many teachers, I mean, I think it behooves us to recognize that it is for many teachers, because the reality is we do have a lot of entitled, let's say entitled and privilege hoarding. I'm sorry, I'm getting a call. And apparently it's coming through to apparently, let me turn off my Bluetooth on my phone so that it's not coming through my headphones. But coming back to, like, again, the term gifted being a trigger, and remind me where I was, Carrie. I lost my train of thought a little bit, but that
that the term gifted can be
that for some teachers, like in every, like so many schools and districts, but especially I'm going to say more financially affluent districts that are very achievement oriented, and there's that individualist culture, like get ahead, I want my kid to win, right?
Yes.
That teachers, including myself prior to being in the field, like you kind of associated that entitled privilege hoarding behavior, the securing of more resources for my kids so my kid can again be on the top.
Yeah.
You associate with giftedness, right? So then I think we have to also honor the fact that there are teachers that I'm going to say have also had vicarious trauma by how they've been treated by certain parent and caregiver populations. And unfortunately, it's sometimes tied to gifted, even though like families who truly do have neurodivergent gifted really mostly just want their sensory, emotional, basic needs met.
Yeah.
Right? They just want their children to have a chance to learn at school too. But it's something that we have to address, the word and not language. And so I want to just make sure that I'm fully answering your question. But like, I think what I heard is that you want to, like, how do you address that, the gifted side, and the, like, in terms of when there's intellectual, like when the intellectual, like, and growth needs are not being met, specifically in academic growth needs.
Yes.
And so you can, really, like, I think focusing on the social emotional and how, like, the impact of mental health. And this is kind of where we can segue to a little bit to, like, kind of maybe sources of educational trauma or neglect, right? Because I think oftentimes people don't realize that educational practices might result in certain in gifted children, neurodivergent gifted children feeling unsafe at school. So it's not necessarily malintentioned, but not realizing the impact of practices. So one of the things that we can do is just generally partner with organizations that are speaking generally to practices that might cause harm. So it's not specific, like, oh, you're doing this, but like, oh, these are things generally that can cause harm, right? When we're advocating. So we know, like, denying a student access to subject to grade acceleration if they're not scoring perfectly, that can be a source of neglect, right? Because a child, like, I'm just becoming a teacher, I think that I had to score like 80% on the praxis test to become a professional educator, right?
Yes.
And you probably can speak to the speech
many
language test.
Many of them.
But like, there are times that, a student, well, like, oh, they only scored 95th percentile and they still got one or two wrong. Well, we wouldn't keep an adult from becoming a professional if they scored that level. So why are we denying the child access to, learn if they didn't score perfectly, right? Withholding. So with anytime we're withholding access to equitable growth and learning opportunities, it's a form of educational oppression or neglect.
Right.
That can cause harm. And when I say harm, I mean like psychological injuries that are tied to oppression, right? Which is still a form of violence at its heart. I know we don't, it's something we don't want to think that violence happens at schools, but it does. Educational neglect. So expecting a child to ask their teacher for new learning opportunities, right? Like, for a child that's not, like, I think sometimes the resistance might be like, oh, well, and Joe didn't come, like, if Joe already knows this, Joe should be able to come up and ask for something different, Well, how many adults do that? We can't expect that of especially like elementary age students for whom, especially when we haven't provided the coaching and instruction and how to advocate yet, and for
Mm-hmm.
whom it's oftentimes really socially intimidating when there's that kind of
Yeah.
power imbalance between a teacher and a student.
Yeah.
Um, and then I think like another thing that, we can support with education to help inspire changes in practices. When it comes to the gifted population, their executive function skill development is oftentimes on a different timeline too,
Yeah.
right? That most students, like when you're talking about middle school, the executive function skills usually
Mm.
kick in between like ages 9 to 12 when that cognitive pruning occurs. But for
Mm-hmm.
students with IQs over 120, the research shows that actually it might be like age 13 to 19. Like it's an extended
Oh,
developmental time period, which in the long term, they said there's cognitive benefits to. But if your executive function skills, if you happen to be on like more like the 19 side of
okay.
things, which like I have like, I had one student that like was closer to 13, 14 and one that was later. And
Sure.
that makes middle and high school really challenging because the
Ooh.
way grades are now,
Mm-hmm.
they're oftentimes more a reflection of children's executive function skill development. Can you follow the directions clearly? Are you well organized? Are you able to submit the different pieces on time?
Yeah.
Right? Those like meeting those executive function expectations
Mm-hmm.
influence your grade as much as your
Yes.
content expertise and skill development. And
Yeah.
so making sure like that's a place if we're grading based on executive function skills and we're not providing accommodations for that, it's a place that again, like our gifted students might be neglected. And so I think when that's happening, then if you can advocate at a greater level for to illustrate sources of gifted harm, including like explicitly naming some of the microaggressions that gifted
Mm-hmm.
children report experiencing in the school
Yeah.
setting.
Yeah.
If we can name those so people can start to recognize them and
Mm-hmm.
what ableist practices might look like,
Yeah.
um, it's sometimes change happens slower than we'd like. But in the meantime, like as parents, then we're in a place where we have to make decisions about the environment and whether the environment is um, causing harm, or can we do a modified schedule? Can a
Mm.
child come and participate in specials, and can they maybe do some creative like math if you don't have access to acceleration for math,
Mm-hmm.
or they can do an online math program, for example, that's at their level. Um, can we support that in a different way, right? In presenting some solutions rather than the challenge and some different options,
Yeah.
and offer to be partners. Our partners in finding solutions is probably the best way to help your child get access to what they need. Is that too
Yeah.
long of an answer? I don't know if that's what you're looking for, Carrie, or not.
I I think it's great. I love the way you segued into the next piece of what I was going to ask as well, because that's a huge piece is the neglect and the oppression for this group of kiddos. And yes, so I appreciate that. Yes, you
Did
did.
I skip your question? I'm sorry.
I think it was in there. I think it was good. um, and I'm not sure. One other question we had talked about was practices that affirm identities and nurture belonging. Did you want to touch on that?
Oh, that was in there. Yeah. And so I kind of did. Oh, I'm sorry.
No,
I
that's
totally
okay.
missed that. But I think, every single child, seeing them through the lens of their strengths and potential with attention to their needs, right? And
Mm,
providing meaningful, like truly meaningful instruction that feeds their interests, right? That like right now we're already having a crisis of meaning, right?
mm,
And I'm going to say a student and teacher existential crisis to a certain extent in schools, right? Since No Child Left Behind, we are so
mm,
focused on teaching academic skills, sometimes outside of context and meaning and purpose,
yeah.
that we're not like when that happens, when it's not tied to the why, we don't children don't see the connection to themselves and the community. And also oftentimes too, then when we have such rigid prescriptive curriculum, and thinking in mind too, a lot of that legislation happened before the internet, when kids could get online and answer any question, right? Like to a certain degree, like content becomes irrelevant, right? Like we want to make sure that children know how to ask high quality questions, that they can discern the validity and reliability of sources and connect with, you know, high quality sources to help them answer their questions. We're living in a different world than the legislation,
that's true,
and you know, was birthed from. And so the consequence of that is that like we have less space for as teachers oftentimes to answer student questions, right? Because that's where the gold is. When by the time, like the research shows now by 5th grade, that teachers are answering all the questions. So I'm going to say, in terms of neuroinclusive and nurturing feelings of belonging, is creating space and time for students to find answers to questions that are personally meaningful for them, personally meaningful, right?
Yes.
And so that we can reveal their strengths and find, and so they have that purpose at school that also feeds ultimately purpose in life. Validating their lived experiences. I know as a parent, like as a parent of neurodivergent gifted youth, that you probably see that oftentimes they get like the deficit messaging, right? That they're too sensitive, too intense, they ask too many questions, like they're just too much.
It's
right?
a lot sometimes, yes.
Right. And so neuro-inclusive schools that nurture belonging are validating those lived experiences, right? There isn't that deficit messaging, right? And it sometimes comes in subtle ways. I don't know if you've seen this, Carrie, but one of the subtle ways that I see really frequently in schools, especially when it comes to processing speed for our quick processors, like the speed that they feel most comfortable moving at, like where they're most relaxed, like if you would have a heart rate monitor on them where they're like, ooh, zen, this is my zen, is an irritant sometimes for teachers, because our kids are moving too fast. Right. And so then the teachers project onto the student that they must be anxious because the student's making them anxious. And then they try and control it by slowing down the speed more. It's like a power move that teachers sometimes do. Have you noticed this? Where then they purposely, it's like teachers or coaches, right? Where they purposely slow down because they're trying to slow down the child to make it comfortable for themselves. And then in so doing, they create more of an irritant for our kids unknowingly. Right.
They're ready to move on.
That's one. And so then those things like tied to, I think, what we were talking about in the beginning too. And I didn't want to be duplicative, right? Like the sensory mindful environment, all of those things that we spoke about in the beginning are going to also support feelings of belonging. And one way that you can measure as a teacher, independent of whether your school or district is taking climate data, we can do like I call it rounding. We can do rounding. I have fireworks going on and I don't know why.
I don't know how I can add. Is it?
Okay.
It's telling us 10 minutes, maybe? I'm not sure.
Oh, I don't know.
It's a new Zoom. It's a new world. I don't know.
I think I've had that happen before. Certain words are like celebration, or if you do certain things, I think it does that now. So I don't know what, maybe you can go back on the recording and figure out what I said that caused the fireworks. And now I forgot.
I'm sorry, Kate.
No, that's okay.
I don't know what it did. No. Okay.
That's it. No, I don't know where we went either, but in terms of, I don't know, it'll come back to us, or it might not. And if so, it wasn't meant to. Oh, I know, rounding. We were talking about rounding. And so as a teacher, you can develop a rounding practice. And even if you're just asking like 3 questions, right? And you're setting a time, even if it's once a month or every couple of weeks, to ask children. And I like to use speech to text technology because so that students can see that I'm recording exactly what they said.
Oh,
It's
that's
not my
fun.
interpretation of what they said, right? Where was your greatest learning, right?
Mm.
So if we're asking that, we're learning like what is really inspiring students. And we're also getting good data if they're saying like, oh, well, I didn't really learn much like in the last few
Yeah.
weeks, right? Where was your greatest learning? So you know that and you're in that you have data to hold ourselves as adults accountable to make sure that again everyone's growing. Where was your greatest learning? What would you change if you could, right? Like, because I think a lot of times as adults we think we know. If we have a reflective practice as a teacher, we think we know
Mhm.
what kids would change. But sometimes we're surprised if we have that practice of actually asking them. And practice of asking them makes children feel connected and belong,
Yeah.
nurtures those feelings of belonging and makes them
Yeah.
feel like their opinions matter, right? And
Mhm.
especially if then we're adapting and changing in response to what they're giving us. And then
Yeah.
asking them, what are they curious to learn more about, right?
Love
As a
that.
practice,
Yes.
because what they were interested in at the beginning of the school year when you did that interest inventory might be different than what they say in October or January. And
Yeah.
then to the extent that we can integrate those interests
Mhm.
into our instruction, um, is I just makes teaching really fun and really makes each student each student feel that they have a critical role in the community.
Yeah, it's really empowering for our kids. I saw that with my son this year when he got to choose his animal to do the animal study and
Yeah.
yeah, and got to think outside of the box. He really felt so empowered and it really nurtured his heart. Like he was so happy and he didn't have to just complete a worksheet on it. He really got to
Yeah.
dive in and learn all these things and it was magical to watch that happen in a
Oh.
classroom. Yeah, so and yeah, he felt so happy there. And I love all of these pieces and I think it's so applicable. There's so many kids out there. It feels, I don't know if I'm in a very small community where it feels like it's so common nowadays, but I feel like there's just so many kids born with this zest for life and this zest for learning. And so it's wonderful to have these insights and these pieces that we can share with others. So I
Well, and I
appreciate
think
that.
it's both, right? Like I think there's
Yeah.
evolution, right? So children should be coming through more sensitive
Hmm.
with like more capacity, hopefully, than the
Yeah.
adults before them. And
Yeah.
I think also where we happen to live, there's a high percentage of employers of
Cool. Yeah.
neurodivergent adults, right? Because we
Yeah.
live close to NCAR, NIST, NOAA, Ball
Yeah.
Aerospace,
Yep.
Google,
Yep.
CU,
Yep.
and so many like innovative tech startups that are,
Hmm.
leading edge. And so I think it's both, Carrie. I think
Yes.
they're coming in wired.
Yep.
There's more neurodivergence, and I think we're also in a unique pocket.
That's true. Okay. I love that. Okay, there's an evolutionary piece of it too. I was curious because I felt like I was hearing it so much every time I describe my kids or someone listens to the podcast. They're like, oh my gosh, you're describing my child. I'm like, okay, because I felt so alone for so long. It's nice to
Mm.
hear that there's other people out there going through the same thing. And is there anywhere that people tuning in, if anything really resonates or they'd like to check out your program, how can they find you, Dr. Kate?
Oh, sure. Right. So again, I have two roles. I at Soul Spark Learning.
Mhm.
You can find me at kate@soulsparklearning.org.
Perfect.
And so
Soul
we
Spark.
have actually we're doing an educator well-being event August
Oh.
1st at the Neurodiversity Community Center in Lafayette for those who are local.
Oh.
That's one of the things we do is bring educators together because there's strength
That's great.
in those numbers to support advocacy. And again, making sure that our neurodivergent gifted students have what they need at school too.
Mhm.
And then also if you I also am both a gifted and special education teacher in Boulder Valley School District as well, and so you can find me through Boulder Valley School District also.
Perfect. Thank you so much for being a guest today.
Oh, thank you so much for having me. It was fun. I enjoyed our time together.
Well, that's a wrap. Thanks so much for tuning in, Changemakers. This is Carrie, and I just wanted to send one more reminder. If you haven't done a review for us, 5 stars and a little few words about what you've enjoyed in our podcast episodes, we would really appreciate it. One other thing, if you guys would like to ever message me, I would love any questions you have or any feedback at info@hearttoheartlife.com. We also have a brand new website, which we're super excited to share. It's hearttoheartlife.com. Thanks so much for tuning in, and happy life, happy times, Changemaker families.